Thank you, Michael. Yeah. Let's have one final round before we go to audience questions and questions from Second Life. And so I will ask, what would your recommendations be to our colleagues in the audience about what they can do to try to maximize their voice, to struggle to get their message out, in spite of some of the psychological and institutional challenges that we heard in some of our earlier panels? Would you like to start with that, Alexandra?
Yes, and I would
Tough,
start by
tough question.
Well, I would start by saying I don't want you to. That's not what I do. I'm a journalist, and I do believe in objectivity. And your political message is your problem. I don't, I want to hear it. I don't want to help you. What I am interested in as a reader is a certain kind of clarity. And you mentioned the word narrative. And I'm actually quite optimistic about old media and new media and how it's working and how people are able to use it and get their voices heard. What concerns me is the confusion and the lack of clarity and the lack of a narrative that happens when you have this much information swirling around. And the analogy I would use is perhaps, I don't know, the weekly reader, for children used to have these pictures of the jungle, and children would have to try to find the hidden image of an iron or a bucket. And in the same way, you're looking through all these screens, your website as well as mine, and there are these little gems. There are these interesting stories, but it's out of context because it's in a blur with everything else. And what I would add, I hope we'll discuss it and it'll come up, is obviously newspapers like mine try to provide a service in making these things clearer and providing a narrative so that you know where a story has been going, what's been happening at the FCC. But if it's this difficult, then why isn't academia doing a better job? And I'm just going to throw this out. I was thinking of the Columbia School of Journalism as making a real effort to train young journalists in the basics now that they didn't used to do about history. But is anyone teaching young academics to have journalistic clarity? I bring it up because I read some abstracts on my way here. And they were incomprehensible. They were not written in English. They were not written for an audience. These things are now available to me and you on the web. And they might as well be in Russian, because the vocabulary isn't clear, because it's exactly what Orwell deplored, only the problem isn't government's writing, and it isn't journalistic writing, it's academic writing. So that, to me, is something that everybody has an interest in helping. And your political message will come through whether I want it to or not. So.
Let me follow up a bit on that. And I'm very, as the new dean of a journalism and communication school, I think you've hit the nail on the head, is what are we teaching the next generation? How do we teach them about interactivity and online content creation?
I want them to not use that word. I don't want them to use the word interactivity. That's not a word. I want them to describe what it is. I don't know what interactivity is.
Well, we'll debate that
That's
as we go.
But
let me give you an example. We had a discussion with 28 of the leading, some of the online publications. It was CNN Online, and it was USA Today Online. It was also Yahoo News Online.com. Very interesting point came up, which is maybe the intersection of our audience and the New York Times and other traditional media. Today, something like 2% of the stuff that appears in broadcast and in traditional media, only 2% comes from those guys out there, from the audience. It is likely that with the advent of the cell phone and its associated camera, that 2% is going to double or triple over the next 5 to 10 years. In other words, citizens, call them citizen journalists or just passers-by in San Diego with a cell phone, when fire jumps from here to there, will send that into the New York Times or send it into NBC or CBS. And so the boundary between those folks out there who can do whatever they want to do and the the traditional news organizations will perhaps begin to break down. And I'm wondering if that poses particular challenges to the way you see those guys and the way those guys see you in terms of either the content or the political ideology that they will bring to you.
I still think you have to have gatekeepers, you know, because we know, I've worked in television, as I said, and sat in an edit room where the temptation often is to make someone more coherent than they actually were. Because you've got a limited amount of space to get this thing across. You don't do it in the end, I hope not, but I think it happens. I know it happens. And you can edit people. So I'm wondering if you can't do the same thing out there with one of those telephone cameras. So how do you know whether you can trust this information or not? You've got to have some gatekeepers. I'm not making a case to retain our editors, but you got to have somebody like a Walter Cronkite, you know? I mean, even if it's a young Walter Cronkite or a young Arthur Gelb or a young William Shawn or Nick Lemon, you've got to have a gatekeeper who can analyze this information because it can be distorted.
And there was a piece by the Ombudsman of the time, or the public editor of the Times, who said something very interesting about this notion of voice and authority of the New York Times with this unruliness that's taking place in the blogosphere. And they were trying to figure out, well, what should you allow from you people out there to appear in the pages of the New York Times? And so they were wrestling with that. But I know, Josh, that's something that you have wrestled with. In fact, I think you have, if I'm not mistaken, you have certain standards, and if people start yelling and screaming at one another in a non-civil way in your blog, that they get edited out to a certain extent. How do you address that issue?
Well, I mean, there's two different issues for us. One is how we run the stuff that we publish, and you know what publish means gets a little blurry, but it's not. It's a very clear-cut thing for us. So there are the things that the people who work for the company publish, and that in that case, the standards are really not that much different from they would be at a conventional publication. Same kind of editorial oversight, final responsibility of the publisher and editor for what's published, etc. We have discussion areas where there people can, you know, just submit stuff and, you know, have conversations and comments. And there, yeah, we do the best we can not to constrain those conversations to edit out views we don't like, but there's a certain level of civility that I think is just necessary to stop a, you know, total breakdown of the venue.
Do you, when you do that, do you, however, feel that so the point that Charlene raised, which is that, well, if people want to speak that way, if that's what really motivates them, then why should you cut out their passion and the language that they choose to use? Does it ever bother you or your editors that you're sort of reducing some of the authenticity that's coming from your readers?
You know, I mean, there are all sorts of ways that we limit our authenticity. You know, we use bathrooms, you know, we dress ourselves in the morning. You know, but in all seriousness, I'm not sure I want to buy onto all the implications of it, but there's a certain broken windows theory behind how I think about it. There's a certain level of hostility, coarseness of language, what I would call almost like verbal violence, that is just not conducive to having a venue where people can talk even heatedly sort of across their differences.
Now, Michael, I know that the FCC recently has been, there's been a lot of public pressure on your institution to try to deal with the issue of coarseness, pornography, violence on television.